Welcome to Now Innovating, a research to impact series at the University of Calgary. I'm your host, Julia McGregor. This episode, we speak with Dr. Christopher Clarkson, professor in the Department of Earth, Energy and Environment in the Faculty of Science. Chris is the director of the Tight Oil Consortium, an industry and government-sponsored group focused on multidisciplinary approaches to reservoir characterization and engineering. His applied research explores ways to enhance the extraction efficiency of Canada's unconventional hydrocarbon resources and develop new technologies and methods for sustainable resource development. Hi, Chris. Welcome to Now Innovating.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really happy, and thank you for letting us film in your lab today. We'll get some fancy core samples next to us. Yeah. I'm excited to learn more. I provided a very general summary of your research, and I know you've recently received lots of accolades for the work that you're doing with the Tight Oil Consortium, including the NSERC Synergy Award for Innovation. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
It's a huge honor and amazing. So I would just love if you could just tell us a bit more about the research that you do with the TOC.
Sure. Love to do that. What researcher doesn't want to talk about the research?
Exactly.
So maybe a little background first. When I came to the university back in 2009, it was really at the onset of what we call the shale gas boom that took off in the United States. And some of those technologies that were developed for the shale gas boom were now being adopted in Canada to help develop some of our low permeability, or what we call unconventional resources, oil and gas resources here in Western Canada in particular. And, so technologies such as multi-fractured horizontal wells, or horizontal wells that are hydraulically fractured in multiple stages, were being used and, to develop these resources. And that brought on a lot of challenges in terms of, interpreting data from the wells, trying to characterize the reservoirs and things like that. And so that led us to start thinking about, okay, what can we do in the research space to help that proceed here in Canada? And that led us to the idea of starting Tight Oil Consortium. So tight oil is oil from low permeability reservoirs, essentially. And, really the remit of that consortium is to develop advanced field and laboratory-based techniques to characterize and evaluate these low permeability resources. So we've been focused on developing these technologies essentially to help with the efficiency of the development of the resources, and doing that in an environmentally sustainable way. Starting with the field technologies, we developed a new well testing method called DFIT-FBA. DFIT-FBA stands for Diagnostic Fracture Injection Test Flowback Analysis.
Okay.
It's a mouthful. So basically, it's a new well test method that's used to get information about the reservoir. So the reservoir pressure, the reservoir permeability, or how easily the fluids flow through the reservoir, in situ stress and things like that. And it's really a complement to the existing well test technologies that exist out there, and we think is a significant advancement. And we're seeing a lot of uptake in that technology. So that's one example. We've been continuing to develop a technique called rate transient analysis. In essence, what that is we take production data from a multi-fractured horizontal well, and we use the rates and the pressures, and we use that information to extract information about the reservoir. So again, permeability, fracture properties, fluid in place. And all of that information is used to help efficiently develop the reservoir. So that technique, RTA, has been around for quite a while, very common reservoir engineering technique, but it had to be modified to apply to these unconventional reservoirs.
Right.
Some complexities that we see, multi-phase flow, unique reservoir properties, complex fractures, interwell communication, all this stuff that we have to worry about now that we didn't have to worry about 10, 15 years ago. And then a specific area of RTA is what we call flowback analysis. That's RTA applied to very early time production data where after you've hydraulically fractured the well, the fluids coming back are mostly your hydraulic fracturing fluids. People never really analyzed that quantitatively until we started to apply RTA techniques to that to characterize hydraulic fracture properties and use that for subsequent design of hydraulic fracturing in a well. So it's called flowback analysis, and it's something that we've helped pioneer and advance. And then in the field-based side, again, another technology, post-fracture pressure decay, which is pressure data collected after a well's been hydraulically fractured. We can analyze that pressure decay for properties of interest. On the laboratory side, probably the most significant innovation is what we call RTA-PK, rate transient analysis, porosity, permeability, which is a core analysis technique that's really designed to try to reproduce conditions that we see in the field, how a well operates, et cetera. And we analyze the data exactly the same way. We're using RTA techniques applied to the data just like we do in the field. And that's really one of the things that we've tried to focus on in our group is develop laboratory techniques that represent the real world. Yeah, so that's kind of a high-level overview of the technologies that we've developed, really just trying to increase the efficiency of development, lower the environmental impact, and really make these technologies work for the companies that are working with us.
Really cool work that you're helping to support the oil and gas industry and that piece. So that's really neat and great examples, obviously, of lab-based stuff going into the real world and being used. So with I'm going to say the acronym wrong again, but the diagnostic fracture injection test flowback analysis. How do you say it faster?
Oh, you got it.
Yeah,
you nailed it.
Can you just tell us a bit more about that and
Sure.
really how the impact that it is having in the industry?
That's a technology that we started working on probably about 5 years ago. Basically, what we do is we inject fluid into a reservoir, and we create a mini hydraulic fracture. And then once we've created that, we shut the pump off, and we observe a pressure fall off over time, and we interpret that pressure fall off for properties of interest. The primary issue with it really is the amount of time it takes to get the data. So that pressure fall off can take days, weeks, months.
Oh, really?
Before you can analyze it quantitatively for reservoir properties. And so an alternative to that, which was suggested not by us, but by basically a hydraulic fracture engineer back in the late 1970s, was to flow back. So after you create your mini fracture, instead of shutting and waiting for that pressure fall off to occur over a long period of time, you actually flow back. And what that does is it accelerates the fracture closure. It accelerates your ability to observe minimum in situ stress. The problem with it, though, again, they all have challenges, was that you flow back and the fracture closes very quickly and you lose the connection between the well and the reservoir. So what my team did was really we redesigned that flowback defit to get the reservoir information. So we suggested flowing back at a slower rate, so the fractures close more slowly, and that maintains that connectivity with the reservoir, and then analyze the data just like we do production data, the RTA technique. We apply that to the flowback data of the defit to get our reservoir information. We're able to get all the same information as a conventional defit, but instead of days, weeks, or months, it takes a couple of hours. There's a real advantage there, right, in terms of time. And that's really encouraged operators to do more of these tests, which is advantageous to society because we really want to get more data, right? So they're more likely to implement it in the field because it doesn't disrupt their operations. And so that's been a real advantage. But beyond that, we've seen some really important innovations in terms of application. So to give you some examples, conventional defit is normally performed at the end or toe of a long horizontal well at one point. With defit FBA, we can do it at multiple points along a well during one day. And that allows you to get information along the well because these wells can be, several kilometers long.
Yeah.
And the reservoir properties change a lot from one end to the other. So we're able to characterize the reservoir along the well, which helps with fracture design, optimizing development, et cetera. So that's been one big advantage. And we've demonstrated it with one of our TOC partners. So that's one topic. And then a very important topic here for Western Canada is the idea of trying to mitigate the effects of induced seismicity, earthquakes caused by hydraulic fracturing. And so we've figured out a way to detect fault zones with DFID FBA. We're creating just a mini fracture, so we're not going to induce seismicity with that, but we can detect where that fault zone is and determine whether that's going to impact the subsequent operations in terms of induced seismicities. We've seen in the literature people taking our technology and applying it to enhanced geothermal systems. So it has applications well beyond the hydrocarbon industry. And in terms of impact, to address the second part of your question, we've our TOC partners and other industry have implemented over 300 of them now. We've worked with operators in Australia to test it, and there's several operators that have tried it in US plays as well.
Wow.
And here in Canada, the regulators, the BC Energy regulator has already adopted it as a standard well test technique. And here in Alberta, the Alberta Energy regulator is looking at adopting it as well. So very exciting in terms of how it's being used.
Definitely, that's amazing. I didn't realize about the Australia testing piece of that too. That's really cool. So I guess I didn't really ask about this earlier too. Like I think such a thing that makes the Tight Oil Consortium like so unique is really the industry partnerships that you do. So like, how does that actually function? Like, does industry come to you with like, we see this challenge? Like, can you explain a bit more about that?
So just before I get to the industry part, just the way that we're structured in TOC really is an outcome of my experience in industry. So I was in industry for 11 years before I came here. And I had the privilege of working in several instances on an asset team and how an asset team functions. It was a great experience in general, being able to work with these other people that have a different discipline than you, but there's obviously there's overlap and you can work together to solve a common problem. And so my experience was so good with that I thought, well, when I come to the university, I want to set up my research team like a mini asset team where we have different disciplines, students with different disciplinary backgrounds working together and solving these research problems. I'm lucky in a sense that I'm an engineer with a geoscience background. And so I have an adjunct professorship over in chemical and petroleum engineering, and I have a professorship here in earth energy and environment, formerly geoscience. And so I'm able to supervise geoscience and engineering students. I have them in the same lab working together on these problems, and it's a great experience for the students. I think it invites in innovation, and students have opportunities to lead projects and things like that. So there's that as well. And so that's kind of how we function internally.
That's cool.
And then the industry piece, that's critical to what we do, obviously. So in our engagement with them kind of starts at the top, where we have an industry advisory board, where we have representatives of all our sponsoring companies that help us make decisions on research direction. What grant opportunities should we pursue? What are the main objectives of that research? So that's important, really working with them to guide the research. And then of course there's the day-to-day working with the industry on projects. So we, probably as closely as anybody here on campus, we work with our industry partners to collaborate on research projects, and they have representatives that come in and help mentor the students and help define the projects that, way beyond providing data. And they're the ones that make it happen, right? So we've been lucky because we've had partners that are willing to try things in the field. DFID FBA, we presented the idea at a sponsors meeting, and then just a few months later, one of the operators said, "Hey, we're gonna try this.
Cool.
We're gonna go out and try it and see what happens." And fortunately, it was a successful test. And so we need to have those partners that are willing to try, and we've been very fortunate to have partners do that. So that's kind of how we work. It's like I said, asset teams internally that are working on partnership or partner problems and solving those problems collaboratively is really how we operate.
So we've got the TOC, but you've also launched the Transitional Energy Consortium, so the TEC.
Yes.
So can you tell us a bit more about this initiative too?
Happy to. So yeah, it gets a little confusing internally as you get TOC, TEC, which one's which.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's obviously a relationship between the two. So going back a few years ago now, we realized based on what we were seeing with some of the technologies in TOC that we could also apply those technologies to what we call subsurface transitional energy pathways. So steps.
Okay.
Steps. So that's an acronym. And what are those? So those are things such as CO2, geological CO2 storage, geothermal energy, hydrogen production and storage, and critical elements recovery. We realized those technologies can be applicable to that. And so that's really the remit of TEC, is to take technologies that have been developed through TOC, adopt them to subsurface transitional energy pathways, but also, of course, develop some new technology.
Yeah.
So even before TEC started, we worked with a company called Civictus, and we helped to design, implement, and analyze a CO2 injection pilot in the deep Mannville coal right here in Alberta. And so we designed the testing for them, analyzed the data for them. And a lot of the well testing techniques that we applied and their analysis methods and things like that were things that we had learned through TOC, just applied to coal and to CO2 injection in coal. And so that was really the start of me going, well, geez, we should really expand this and formalize it in a new consortium. So that was a great experience. And then once TEC was formed, we really started to explore that more actively. Another example is we're working with several companies that are looking at injecting CO2 into the Leduc Formation here again in Alberta. But now companies are looking at places where there isn't oil. It's more brine or deep saline aquifer system. They're looking for places to store the CO2 in these saline aquifer systems. So we've been working with these operators trying to evaluate the reservoir properties, both in the Leduc as well as in the cap rock of the seal for the CO2 system, using, again, laboratory methods, just like what we have here in this lab. In fact, that is a Leduc core right behind you. Trying to characterize the properties and helping understand, how much CO2 can we inject, and how mobile is it going to be when it moves, gets into the reservoir. Is it going to stay there? Is the seal appropriate? So we've got the technologies to help quantify that. And several operators working with them. We've got projects in critical element recovery. We're looking at hydrogen injection and storage into coal and other reservoirs as well. We've demonstrated that we can apply post-fracture pressure decay, DFID FBA, to characterize the fracturing in these deep geothermal systems as well. So yeah, we're having fun with it. And as soon as we started with the idea of TEC, the light bulb went on, and all these new ideas and research pathways really. We've been kind of riding that wave now for a couple of years, and it's just a very exciting time for us. So
yeah, that's just amazing too. Yeah. Taking the existing tech from TOC and just applying it to another section. That's so cool.
It's been a great couple of years working on that type of stuff.
How do you have any time?
It's tough, but I'm always, every time a new research idea comes up, I'll give you an example. I was I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and interwell communication's a big thing, right? How do we evaluate wells when they're talking to each other? How do we apply RTA, which is really a single well technique, to that problem? And I had this idea coming home on the plane, and so I texted one of my research associates, "Hey, can you try this real quick? I'm like, I got to see if it works." And so you're always willing to just, if an idea comes to you, you got to pursue it right away. And there's been a lot of cases like that where the RTA PK was the same thing. Light bulb comes on, and it's like, oh, we got to try this right away and see if it works. And it's just, they're always willing to make time for that.
Chris, your work is it's such a great demonstration of really academic and industry partnership.
Thank you.
And I was curious about what advice would you have for other researchers who are really looking to engage industry?
I'm going to take a page from my friend and colleague, Greg Welch, who I know you interviewed here. Instead of offering advice, maybe share experience.
Yeah, perfect.
Probably a better way to look at that. I came from an industry background, and one of the things I learned as part of that is really what drives the industry. What are they looking for when it comes to R&D? What are they trying to achieve? And at the end of the day, they have to demonstrate that whatever technology that they adopt has to add value to their company, to their shareholders. They want to look for competitive advantage. That's always a big thing. So developing or working on technologies that obviously have impact for them is kind of priority number one. I got a little insight into that. I worked for a company and I was working for a research group on unconventional resources. And our group actually sponsored research at different universities. I'm not going to say who. In order to justify funding for a particular school, we had metrics, and obviously a lot of those metrics were, how is this going to impact our business and things like that. So I got a lot of insight into how that worked as part of one of my roles, a little insider information. And so that helped me understand, okay, how do we sell the technology, if you will, to the companies. And so that really gave me a way or strategy to engage industry partners. So obviously doing that kind of research and trying to figure out what's impactful, maybe what isn't so much, was important. And once we started to get some traction in the research side and RTA and things like that, obviously taking that and advertising it as well as you can. It's easier to do today, right? And with social media and webinars, podcasts, all these things, they didn't really exist, going back 15 years ago. And so, we did it the old-fashioned way, conferences, networking with industry partners. I would incorporate the research into my short courses to show, hey, what we're doing in the research side is really impacting the technologies. That was a very, very effective way to educate the partners on what we could do in the research space. And in fact, a lot of our TOC sponsors are a direct result of those short courses, because they could really connect the dots on how your research could impact what they're doing. And that's really been the strategy that we've used from day one with TOC and now with TEC as well.
And I know in our Office of the Vice President of Research here, we do now, there's a newer team that is industry partnerships for research. So we have a team that can help support researchers across campus who maybe not have those connections to begin with. Right. You've got this well established. So it's really, I think, an exciting time for other faculty members to look at how they can engage with industry.
Well, as I get further along in my career, I realize, I have to spend some time and try to help others in that space too. And I'm happy to do that. So let me know if you need some help.
So you talked about this a bit, Chris, you're, coming from industry, being a professional engineer, and then coming to a faculty role. And you've talked about some of the skills, recognizing the business cycles and building teams and interdisciplinary collaboration that way. Is that really been the most translational stuff from industry to research, would you say?
A little bit on my history. So before I went to industry, I did an undergrad degree in geological engineering. And then my graduate work was really chemical engineering.
Okay.
And then when I came to the industry, I was a petroleum engineer. So, these are different skill sets, right? And so going through that process, particularly when I got into industry, made me realize, you have to be flexible, you have to be open, you have to be willing to learn new things outside your discipline. And really that multidisciplinary element became very important to me in terms of, working with those teams, learning what others did, what others do, and then becoming more multidisciplinary yourself. Right? Learning to communicate effectively with your team members was a critical thing. So soft skills were important. And then presenting, because many times we had to present to senior management. All of those skills became very, very important once I came into academia, because I applied them to our sponsors as well. And so a lot of the soft skills, communication, learning to be part of a team, those are all things that we try to teach our students and our other researchers in our group as well.
So my last question, and it's kind of a bit more of a retrospective question, right? We're talking about you coming to the university, the big shale gas boom at that point.
Yes.
So how much has the energy research landscape at the university really changed? And what are the trends and things that you're seeing now?
When I first came here, the shale gas boom was on. A lot of, I was part of the new wave of researchers focused on unconventional hydrocarbon resources, tight oil and gas, shale oil, coal bed methane, those types of things. And pretty early on, actually had an opportunity to work with the VPR office. At the time, of course, Dr. McCauley was the VPR. And he asked me to be involved in helping develop the energy research strategy at the time, and to be involved at that level and trying to impact the direction of the university in that space. But was very much hydrocarbon focused, although we did at that time recognize low carbon energy sources as being important, and there was a component of that as well. But yeah, so that was kind of the dominant area of research at the time, and that served us very well. Obviously, it was important in terms of the CFREF that we were able to work in those areas.
So the Global Research Initiative, right?
Yes, yeah. And then over time, we were starting to see more of a transition to transitional energy topics. And that's nicely captured by the new energy research strategy that was rolled out last year. And so we've seen this move towards transitional energy, which is fantastic. I mean, obviously the things that we're doing in Transitional Energy Consortium, very aligned with that new strategy. And then more recently, and very, very importantly, is the transdisciplinary element. That's become a very big priority for the university. What does that mean to us? Well, that means, getting outside your discipline and seeing, how to do research that involves people outside that discipline that are not necessarily technical, right? There's, with these transitional energy ideas, they're not just technical problems that we're solving. There's issues related to regulatory, legal issues, societal impact, social license type issues that you have to be aware of and potentially do active research in that area. An example of that is what we're dealing with Transitional Energy Consortium, is this idea of shared pore space, where you can use a reservoir, subsurface reservoir, for multiple purposes. Give you an example, the Leduc formation, going back to that, the deep saline aquifers in the Leduc. People are looking at that for CO2 storage. People are looking at that for critical element recovery. They're looking at it for geothermal recovery, and which is great. The technical challenges associated with that, but beyond the technical challenges, there's legal issues, right? I mean, if you inject CO2 in one well and that CO2 migrates over to a well that's extracting brine for critical element recovery, and you're taking CO2 out of the reservoir, that's, there's legal issues, there's regulatory issues. In fact, that probably got the hydrocarbon industry in a lot of trouble in the past. They didn't consider a lot of these things, whereas now we realize that's so critical. Moving this transitional energy forward, we have to consider all these things and have to actively engage, and we also have to do research in these areas. And so that's, I think the university is very much aligned in that space, and I think that's important going forward in terms of the future of energy.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule and letting us be in your lab and telling us all about the TOC and the TEC, and it's just really, it's fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I just appreciate the opportunity to share what we've been doing, and hope it was useful.
And congrats again on your NSERC Synergy Award.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
You can find links in our episode description to learn more about Chris's research with the Tight Oil Consortium and the Transitional Energy Consortium. And to find out how to move your research to impact in the UCalgary innovation ecosystem, visit ucalgary.ca/innovation.